What's up, everybody? We're going to talk about Presbyterian denominations today. In fact, we're going to do a tier chart video in which I rank the Presbyterian denominations in order of my own personal preference. Now, the thing about tier charts is they're opinion-based by definition, and so you're going to probably disagree with some of the things that I'm going to say in this video as I rank the various Presbyterian denominations according to how I would personally prefer them. So feel free to correct me or add nuance in the comments if I stereotype or if I strawman or if I diminish your denomination. But the reason I'm doing this is to help people find a good, solid church. I often encounter requests and messages and emails and such to help people find a good, solid Presbyterian church or other solid church in general. And so this video is going to help you to determine that. Again, much of this is going to be my opinion, but I do think that to some extent, my opinion is informed. Now, before we talk about the 8 or so Presbyterian denominations to help you figure out which one you should belong to, if any at all, let me introduce you to 2 books that might be helpful to you as you continue to search through what Presbyterianism is. Okay, the first book is Worshiptainment, the Modern Church's Golden Calf. This is my own book in which I describe the regulative principle of worship, which is basically the idea. It's a Presbyterian idea that we should do in worship what the Bible tells us that God wants us to do. So very simple, but a lot of churches unfortunately don't do that. The other book I want to mention is this one right here, Hold Fast the Faith. It's a devotional commentary on the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is the doctrinal subordinate standards of Presbyterian churches. And all of the Presbyterian churches that I'm going to mention in this video do have some relation to the Westminster Confession of Faith. The question is, how consistently do they apply said confessions? Okay, well, let's go ahead and share screen, and we're going to get into it here. You know how a tier chart works. In order for a denomination to get an S grade, which is superior, they're going to have to meet the following qualifications. For me, it's going to be, are they biblical? Do they strive to be faithful to Holy Scripture? Secondly, are they confessional? How accurately and intentionally do they comport to those standards, the Westminster Confession of Faith and catechisms? Next, is it conservative? Does it uphold traditional historic Christianity? And then finally this, is it evangelistic? How well do they witness to the unbelieving world? Okay. Well, again, I'm going to mention 8 of the denominations that are Presbyterian in the United States, and I'm restricting my list to those in the USA. I realize, of course, that there are a number of Presbyterian denominations that are not here in the United States. And again, you might find a comparable. And if you have some information that I don't have, or if you disagree with me, go ahead and let me have it in the comments. I'll be glad to hear what you have to say. Okay, so we're going to go from worst to first as it relates to these Presbyterian denominations. And we're going to start off here with your bargain basement denomination, the PCUSA. Now, I'm going to try my best to be very nice in this video and say at least one positive thing about every one of these denominations, even though I obviously have my preferences and my strongly held opinions. The best thing that the PCUSA has going for it is that it is historic. In fact, this is the denomination that can trace its roots all the way back to the early pre-revolutionary, pre-founding of America times. This denomination goes all the way back to the 1700s and has a continuous historic line all the way until today. Now, that doesn't mean that there hasn't been various schisms, some people say, who pronounce the word incorrectly, and mergers and so forth, but that notwithstanding, and I do appreciate the historicity of this denomination, it has bequeathed a number of institutions, including a number of seminaries, none of which I would recommend at this point here in 2025. But at least it has longevity attached to it. Unfortunately, the problem with the PCUSA is that being a mainline denomination, like many of the other mainline denominations in the United States, including the United Church of Christ and the United Methodist Church and the Episcopal Church USA and so forth, this denomination is rife with secular liberalism. In fact, this denomination is so infested with secular progressivism that it's hardly distinguishable from, let's say, the leftist Democratic Party. In fact, most of its ideals have long since jettisoned biblical theology and certainly much adherence to the Westminster Confession of Faith at all. Rather, what usually you're going to get in a PCUSA church is lectures on Black Lives Matter, BLM, Marxism, DEI, racism, sexuality, gender inclusivism, homosexuality, LGBTQ+, everything. Gay flags all over the place in the PCUSA for the most part. Now, let's be fair. There are some churches that are conservative in the PCUSA, but when I say conservative, what I really mean by that in relation to the mainline is less secular, progressive, less leftist than other PCUSA churches. Because although there's going to be some people who still adhere to the Word of God and preach the Bible and more or less believe the gospel, you're not going to find any PCUSA churches, hardly at all, if there's even one that exists, that has all male elders, male deacons, male pastor, traditional understandings of human sexuality and gender, and is self-consciously and stridently confessional in its orientation. You're just not going to find that in the PCUSA. The best you can do in the PCUSA is hope that you can find sort of a conservative-ish rural church that probably has a conservative-like pastor that's at least going to be preaching and teaching from the Bible as over against stories of Marxist leftism and so forth and so on. I don't usually recommend the PCUSA. Now, another good thing I'll say about this denomination, there is a larger movement called Reconquista that's led by my friend Redeemed Zoomer, who's trying as hard as he possibly can to reawaken and reinvigorate PCUSA churches by calling conservatives to stay rather than leaving. Now, him and I stridently disagree on this matter. I would personally not raise my family in a PCUSA church. Life is too short, my kids' lives are too precious, and I don't want them brainwashed and corrupted by leftist denominational politics. I just don't have time for that, and I don't think most people do either. I appreciate the courage in the Reconquista movement, but I think for the most part it's a foolhardy endeavor unless and until the denomination collapses to the point that it's basically giving away its buildings for free to conservative church plants and other reformed denominations. So I don't recommend the PCUSA. And likewise, I don't necessarily recommend the Cumberland Presbyterian Church either for reasons that I'll try to explain. The Cumberland Presbyterian Church came about at the time of the Second Great Awakening. Now, more or less, I think that the First Great Awakening of the 1700s was better than the Second Great Awakening of the 1800s. The Second Great Awakening got very campy, and it really started to appropriate some of Charles Finney's revivalistic, quote, new measures, unquote, in which Charles Finney thought that he could basically convert people if he could get the mood right and the emotions right and sort of manipulate the affections of the people. He thought he could steer people into conversionistic experiences. Well, as part of that movement, the Cumberland Presbyterian Church then departed from the ways of the mainline body, but it also departed in some significant ways from some of Presbyterianism's long-held and ardently treasured doctrines, like Calvinism, for instance. Now, most Presbyterian denominations are Calvinistic by definition, but the Cumberland Presbyterian Church got a little weird in that it became one of the only Presbyterian denominations that I'm aware of that went Arminian. Okay, now the PCUSA, which I've already mentioned, is more or less Arminian in as much as it's secular and Enlightenment oriented, but the Cumberland Presbyterian Church kind of switched teams, moving over to Arminianism from Calvinism. And so I don't necessarily recommend that either. Now, it could very well be that there are some solid Bible preaching Cumberland Presbyterian churches, but if there are, I'm not aware of too terribly many of them. Another one of the things that the Cumberland Presbyterian Church did is it reduced ordination standards so as to be able to ordain and install pastors more quickly than the mainline denomination. And so therefore, in my view, it sort of watered down the standards intellectually and in terms of doctrine and training and study that most Presbyterian churches will adhere to. Okay, so I don't necessarily recommend the PCUSA or the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. Let's get into a couple that are a little bit more favorable. The next one is going to be ECO. Now, this stands for the Evangelical Covenant Order of Presbyterian Churches. And this departed from the mainline church not too terribly long ago. It's one of the younger denominations here that we're going to list, and so we can cite that in favor of it. And probably the main reason why the ECO church is split off from the mainline is because of the mainline's strange infatuation with queerness and the LGBTQ plus movement. So while ECO churches tend to retain female pastors, female elders, female deacons, much to the chagrin of Bible-believing conservatives. Nevertheless, it did at least pull away in resistance to the mainline denomination's newfound love of the queerist movement. Okay, so some of your eco churches are going to be fairly conservative. My one gripe about the eco churches is it did something a little bit weird that the mainline body had done sometime earlier, which is to adopt not just one confessional standard, the Westminster Confession of Faith, but a whole series of confessional standards. Now, the mainline did that. Again, I'm sort of blaming the mainline here. The mainline did that so as basically to water down the confessional standards of the denomination entirely. Most Presbyterian churches worldwide have one set of standards, the Westminster Confession of Faith and the catechisms. But what the mainline did is it incorporated a bunch of other documents and statements, the Declaration of Barmen, the Confession of 67, the Heidelberg Confession, which is a good one. Heidelberg's great. The Scottish confessions, the Swiss confession. A lot of those are good, solid, even excellent. But the more standards you have, the less you rigorously use them. And so the PCUSA barely examines their ministers at all based on their confessional standards, unlike some that we're going to see later. And ECO did the same thing in adopting basically a book of confessional standards rather than one standard, the Westminster Confession of Faith. So I'm not a fan of that. Next, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. Now, I was a pastor in the EPC for quite a while, from 2008 to 2019. And it was a solid Bible-believing Reformed and confessional denomination for many years. However, the EPC is in some troubled waters right now. The EPC is considering receiving a church that plagued with many difficulties the PCA, my denomination, in as much as it had a self-professedly gay yet celibate pastor and imbibed in an ideology called Side B Christianity. Well, the PCA is very glad to have that out of our system now that we've worked through some of those issues. But unfortunately, it's right into the box of the EPC's current problems. Not only that, but the EPC is struggling now with some race-oriented dialogues, and unfortunately, leadership has not done much to clear things up. In fact, if you watch the General Assembly of the EPC in the last couple of years, they've been really struggling just to keep their polity in basic order. So one of the things that I like about the EPC is it really does value evangelism and church planting. For the most part, it's conservative, except for that it has female pastors, female elders, and female deacons. I do not like that. And that's one of the reasons that I left the EPC. Though basically a solid body, I do think the EPC is headed towards troubled waters. We'll have to see what happens in the 2025 General Assembly. Would I go back to the EPC? No, I probably would not. In fact, not only did I leave the EPC for the PCA, but so did my church, Faith Church in Brooksville, Florida, is now part of the PCA as well. So thank goodness for that. Let's move up again a little bit more to the ARP. Now, I do have to tell you this personal story here. My mentor, who's with the Lord now, a brother by the name of Dr. Wilfred Bellamy, was the stated clerk of the entire ARP denomination. The ARP is, for the most part, a very good denomination. I don't have a lot of negative to say about it. Not only did my mentor, Dr. Bellamy, lead this denomination at one time, but it has been and continues to be a conservative, evangelistic, confessional, and Bible-believing denomination. Okay. The only thing I would say about the ARP for the most part is there's not too terribly many churches. So if you intentionally went to find an ARP church, you might have a hard time finding one because they're mostly relegated to the central south of the United States. And so there aren't many churches for you to necessarily find, even if you found that you really aligned with the doctrine of the ARP church. Okay. It has a really good directory of public worship, which again, my mentor, Dr. Bellamy, worked on to help solidify the worship practices of the ARP. And I can't really find too much area to fault it other than, again, there's just not too many of them. Wish there were more. It does have connections to the Covenanter movement, as I think I mentioned. And so for all of those reasons, if you can find one that's near you, it's probably going to be a pretty good church to go to. Moving up in the rankings, we move to our brothers in the OPC. Now, the OPC are going to be very close cousins with my denomination, the PCA. We're really close friends. Most OPC churches are very much in line with PCA churches. In fact, our denominations, the PCA and the OPC, twice tried to merge together, but we didn't end up making that merger. And it's probably okay that we didn't do that. My denomination, the PCA, is going to be one of the larger ones on this list, and the OPC is going to be one of the smaller ones on this list. Again, if you can find an OPC church that's near you, you're very blessed to have it, so you definitely should give it a chance. Worship is going to be pretty traditional, pretty liturgical. It's going to be very basic, but basic is good in our world. Not creative, not newfangled, no worshiptainment, none of that nonsense. OPC churches are solid. And the reason that they're solid is that their founder, J. Gresham Machen, was a very solid, expert theologian, coming out of Princeton at that time, founding Westminster Seminary and so forth. Machen was a stud and a mensch. And I highly respect J. Gresham Machen. I certainly would recommend you going to an OPC church. My only fault with the OPC brothers is that they sometimes get really stuck in old debates. For instance, they're probably still arguing about Cornelius Van Til's influence. And as helpful as Van Til was to many people, including my professor, John Frame, who was a Van Tilian scholar himself, not a lot of people out there in the streets are going to be arguing about Van Til. And in some sense, the OPC has a hard time getting stuck in these kind of eddies of theological inquisitiveness out on the side, asking and answering questions that most people on the street aren't asking. And so to that extent, I could wish they were more ardently evangelistic. But alas, they tend to be small churches for that reason, is that they do tend to get sort of whirlpooled into these inter-Presbyterian dialogues that often, I think, prevent them from being as outwardly focused as they could possibly be. So that's my only gripe about OPC churches. Though, again, if you can find one, go to it. It's probably really solid and probably really good place to raise your children in the faith. Next, we're going to go to my penultimate choice, the RPCNA. Now, the RPCNA is certainly one of the most conservative, confessional, faithful, and evangelistic denominations. Again, it's going to be pretty small, though, and mostly you're going to find them in the north, especially around Pittsburgh, western Pennsylvania. Indiana is another hotbed, if I'm not mistaken. There's certainly others around. There's a couple on the West Coast, not too many though. The distinctives of the RPCNA is that these are our psalm singing exclusive friends, whereas every other denomination here listed in my tier sheet, they're going to sing both psalms and hymns and maybe some contemporary praise course as well. Not so much the RPCNA. They only sing the psalms, and that a cappella, which is also going to distinguish them from every other denomination on this chart. But that's not a fault. That's a virtue, in my opinion, because that means they don't get into some of the worship wars related to worshiptainment. They definitely do not fall into that. But not necessarily everybody is looking for a church that sings exclusive psalms and that without instruments. But hey, if that's you, this is going to be a great denomination. They're definitely conservative, definitely faithful, good preaching, good teaching. And how about this? They have an amazing denominational seminary, RPTS, where I'm an adjunct professor. And if you're thinking about going to seminary, probably RPTS, the seminary of this denomination right here, the RPCNA, is going to be the best one available. Now, I'm not saying there aren't other good, solid, confessional, Reformed, and Presbyterian seminaries. Obviously, there's Westminster. There's Gordon Conwell, which is a little bit more evangelical broadly. There's the RTS campuses, okay? But RPTS is second to none, and I think might even be the best in as much as it's small. The classes are taught by pastors who will really love you and care for you, and you can hardly get a better education if being a pastor or a missionary or Bible teacher is really what you want to be, okay? So that's why I rank the RPCNA second. Now, unfortunately, I could not be ordained in the RPCNA because I'm not exclusive psalmody. I'm inclusive, meaning I definitely think we should be singing the psalms, but I couldn't go so far as to put my signature on exclusive psalmody a cappella. And for that reason, though I might have them, they wouldn't have me as an ordained minister. And that's going to lead me then to number one in the champion of this list, the PCA. I love being in the PCA. I've been in the PCA since 2019. The denomination is fantastic. It's growing, it's solid, it's faithful. It's evangelistic, it's church planting oriented. We have some very great old traditional churches. There's going to be a little bit of variation in worship style. Some are going to come across a little bit more evangelical in terms of their worship services, maybe some praise bandy type things. You might find that. But you're also going to find some very conservative liturgical churches with traditional worship like our church, Gospel Fellowship, PCA. But you can know this about the PCA, that pretty much any PCA church you walk into is going to be faithful, Bible-believing, confessional, and evangelistic. It's just a solid name brand. It's almost like Nike shoes. If you get Nike, it's going to be a good shoe. If you go to a PCA church, it's going to be a good church for the most part. Now, again, there's a little bit of weirdness, and every once in a while we do have our controversies, but that's only because we're one of the larger denominations of this list. In fact, we're the second largest next to the main line, but again, I wouldn't touch the main line with a 10-foot pole. But if you have a PCA church in your neighborhood, it's probably worth checking it out. Now, if it strikes you as a little bit too broadly evangelical, then maybe check out an RPCNA or an OPC church, or maybe even an ARP church if you can find one. But basically, the rule is that the name brand of PCA is a reputable, solid Presbyterian denomination that's going to take the Bible very seriously. Most churches are going to preach expository sermons. Your children are going to get catechized in the Westminster Confession of Faith. And you're probably going to make a lot of really good friends. Our denomination is growing really quickly and has an outstanding reputation for the most part. Okay, so there's my opinion on all things Presbyterian. Now, there's some other Presbyterian denominations out there that are too small to mention. There's some Korean Presbyterian denominations and some with Scottish influence and history, but maybe we could talk about those in another video. Again, I just want to remind you one more time, if you're interested in the regulative principle of worship, check out Worshiptainments. And if you're interested in our doctrine, check out Hold Fast the Faith. I'll put links to both of those books in the description of this video. Okay, that's it. That's all I got for you today. Let me know where I got it wrong. I'm sure I did, in your opinion, because this was mine. But I do love you lots, and I'll talk to you later.